Hello, and welcome to our second industry session this autumn. Thanks so much for coming. It's great to have so many of you here. My name's Julia Andrews-Clifford, and I'm the manager of the South East Young Film Programmers Network, and I'm a cis woman, and my pronouns are she or her. These sessions are designed for young programmers and others to get a direct line to talking to professionals from the industry about different aspects of programming and ask the questions they want to know about either getting into the industry or just deepening their knowledge and understanding of film exhibition. We are delighted to have Melanie Iredale from Sheffield Doc today, talking with us about her career as a festival curator and producer, and also the queer gaze and LGBTQI+ programming. So thanks for coming. There's a few things before we start. We have a live captioner today, which is Judith, thank you. And if you want to access those, if you go into the chat function, you'll find instructions there. Secondly, the way we're going to run the session is, for the first half, I'm going to have the privilege of interviewing Melanie myself. And then the second half, I'm booted off and it's over to you. So you can have those questions whenever you like, put them in the Q&A, and when 5 o'clock comes, I will start sifting through those and firing them at Melanie. So the more of those, the better. And just to say, finally, we're really, really delighted to have Melanie here. We know that festivals across the world have struggled this year. Usually Sheffield Doc Fest happens once a year in one big burst of energy in June, but it seems to have been an all year round mission this year. So to give her time for this hour, we really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Oh no, thank you for inviting me. Yeah, I'm really, really pleased to be here. It'll be really, really nice chatting to you, Julia. And yeah, look forward to all of your questions and comments and just any kind of experiences that anybody else wants to share around, you know, programming queer content.
Fantastic. So for those who don't know about Sheffield Doc Fest, it's been going since 1994. It is considered the Doc Fest for Europe and in the top 3 around the world. Melanie's been working as a consultant with them since 2010. And then in 2019, she took the post of Interim Director. And then this year, she's been Deputy Director, which entails co-curating the rhyme and rhythm section of the festival, as well as producing the festival as a whole. Melanie's background is in festival curating and producing, and she comes from East Yorkshire. She is also the BIFA, get this right, the BIFA British Independent Film Award documentary voter, and is often invited to talk about diversity and ethics in the industry. So it's really great to have you. So we'll get started with some of my questions. See, I get first dibs on it all. My privilege and good luck. First of all, a bit about your journey. So you are a young film programmer, really, and I know you're not. I won't ask the age, but you know, as a young programmer, to get to be deputy director of the Sheffield Doc Fest is quite an achievement. So it would be really interesting, especially for our young programmers who are often looking for ways in, and being a young programmer is in itself a way in. If you could tell us a little bit about your journey into where you got today.
Yeah, totally. So, as you said, I'm from East Yorkshire. Well, I've lived all over Yorkshire. I've got a mongrel Yorkshire accent, that's why. But so I went to university in Newcastle. I went to Northumbria University and studied English and film studies. And then from there, got a job tearing tickets at Tyneside Cinema, the kind of indie cinema in Newcastle. I did a few jobs there around box office, admin, and so on. and that's something that I would absolutely recommend to anyone, is to get a job at an indie cinema, you know, box office, ushering, anything like that. I learned a lot about audience behavior, you know, what it is that makes audiences come and choose certain films over others, being able to have those conversations as they enter the cinema and as they exit, you know, like, yeah, I just, that kind of really, you know, hands-on work with audiences is something that I still think serves me really well now. So that's absolutely something that I would recommend to anyone who gets the chance to do that. And then really important for me early on was actually doing one of the independent cinema office courses. Yeah, it was, I'm not entirely sure if this will do it, so Julie, you might know, but it was kind of a crash course in all things programming and marketing. It was a 2-week course, so this is going back some years, and it was definitely was still going for a number of years. I don't know if it still is in quite the same guise, but I mean, independent cinema office course, do a lot of amazing training programs, kind of tailored to all the way through your career. So this one that I did way back when was very much a kind of entry level, kind of, yeah, crash kind of beginner's course, if you like, but yeah, I mean, I've also done one even more recently in leadership, which is how I know Julia. So yeah, so independent cinema office have been kind of really important to my own kind of professional development throughout the years. And off the back of doing that ICO course, the first one, I approached a really small independent cinema in Newcastle called Side Cinema, which is part of the Amber Film and Photography Collective, to ask if I could programme a season of music documentaries there. Music, rock, punk has always been kind of my other passion in life besides cinema. So so the first season I ever programmed was a season of punk documentaries. And it's funny because now I program the Rhyme and Rhythm strand for Sheffield Doc Fest. So in a way, I kind of come full circle. I'm kind of doing what I did when I was like 22 or something. Yeah. But yes, so I did that. I volunteered, which I realise is a luxury that not everyone can afford. I mean, I was, you know, doing that whilst I was working at Times of Cinema and, you know, and had a bar job at the same time. So, you know, I was able to do that because I was juggling doing other things that would pay my rent. And from there, I got a job at Northern Lights Film Festival, which is actually sadly no longer going, but it was a film festival that was run out of the Tyneside Cinema that looked at the relationship between the northeast of England and Scandinavia and like the Nordic countries. It was a UK and Nordic film festival. And I did, yeah, I kind of programmed the UK films as part of that. We had other programmers who programmed the Nordic stuff, so I was kind of involved but not directly programming, but I was like managing that festival. I did that for a few years, and on the side I just kind of built up a freelance portfolio doing I programmed films for another Nordic arts festival that took place in Liverpool. It was a mixed arts festival, but I programmed the films because I've sort of developed relationships with Scandinavia and a kind of taste of Scandinavian cinema and so on that still kind of remains with me. And basically did a lot of kind of gigging as events producer and so on for various film and more broader arts kind of festivals on the side. And then landed the job as director of Berwick Film and Media Arts Festival in, I don't know, 2009, I think this is.
What do you mean landed the job? I'd like the...
Oh, I mean applied, went through a process.
You did a great, obviously, that might become later, what must have been a pretty good application. But you'd got all of that experience that you sort of created for yourself up until that point?
Yeah, I guess that basically for everything that I've done, I think this is probably the only job that I've done as Deputy Director of DocFest, which I've been doing since 2014. I think this is the only job that I've done where I haven't also freelanced on the side as other things. And even that's not true, because I am doing other things on the side now, although voluntary. Yeah, so it was just kind of building up a freelance portfolio on the side of doing a job, which, was, it's not something I'd recommend in terms of work-life balance, but in terms of just getting a lot of different experiences of working with different organizations and different ways of working and kind of partnerships building and stuff, that was how I did it. And yeah, and so working for Berwick was incredible. It's a small but really highly curated festival in a small town.
What do you mean highly curated? What does that mean?
I mean, it's got a real kind of specificity as to what it's looking for. So it was a festival that very much looked at the kind of space between cinema and video art. And so I was interested in the kind of more artistic of cinema, the more artistic side of cinema, and the more cinematic side of video art. And it's like this beautiful space in between, but it's quite specific.
Yeah.
And yeah, and the festival's like, it's moved on a bit, like under new direction, it looks slightly differently curatorially to what I did, and it's incredible. Like the person who took my job has like ran with it, and it's amazing. And that was one of the things I was absolutely gutted to not be able to go to in person this year. But yeah, and it's a town with a real character. It's this old walled town that sits between England and Scotland. It's been passed back and forth 13 times. It's got this incredible kind of history, and it doesn't have a full-time cinema, so it's programming for spaces that are that are kind of site specific, but then commissioning pieces that were meant to be site specific for Berwick, but then would also go on to tour. It was brilliant. Anyway, so I did that, and I freelanced for DocFest on the side as a development consultant. And then I got appointed as Deputy Director in 2014. And so, yeah, my job now involves some programming of the UK competition and the Rhyme and Rhythm strand, and feeding into the programme a little more broadly, and also managing a lot of the kind of back-end operations. So I manage the team, and I oversee HR and,
So, yeah.
And
it's a bigger job, and obviously the curation is part of that, but all of those different aspects, you've obviously, I didn't realise 2014 you were Deputy Director, and then obviously you had so I got that.
Yeah, and then I was interim just for a year when we were between. Yes,
which must have been an amazing experience. But I think it's also interesting for young programmers to see that journey where it wasn't just programming, that broad, term, but from your first pitched festival or season, the punk rock season at the local cinema or side cinema, was you kind of had not a niche, but you were being a bit more specific about your programming and moving into the performance music and getting expertise in that. So I think that's a really useful tip for young programmers, to once you start to feel where your passion lies in film, to develop your knowledge of that, and then the other side of it, to just ask. So if you want to do something, the big secret is ask, because actually most times people say yes, but obviously it's the barrier to thinking they won't, and that can stop you. So I mean, I love that bit of your story. But then again, how it's, you don't land a job, you make the job, and obviously it's very clear in history. So now I'm aware, because I want to get on to the queer gays and LGBTQI+, but I still want to talk a little bit about your role at the festival and ask you a little bit about documentary. So what, you know, what's different about programming documentary, and why have you ended up in documentary? What's it got for you that is appealing?
Yeah, also, I guess I programmed quite a lot of documentary for Berwick, but that would have been very specifically kind of more factual based artist film and video. And there's a kind of connection there, I think, with DocFest, which also programs some really, has quite an experimental kind of take on what documentary can be. I mean, we really do at DocFest show all kinds of documentary, from, you know, the more kind of mainstream stuff to much more kind of authored, you know, kind of artist-led work, and then the more journalistic and the essayistic and everything kind of in between. I guess I should say I was drawn to DocFest probably in terms of its kind of ethics and attitude and values. For me, it wasn't so much being drawn necessarily to documentary personally, although now I'm in this space, I think I would think twice before doing anything else. But yeah, I mean, for me, it's where, you know, my kind of big things in life are art and kind of activism and humanism, and this for me is kind of like this perfect sweet spot in the middle, which is not to say that all documentaries have to have social impact, you know, have to be aiming for social impact. I'm not saying that, because I think that's quite limiting, you know, not all documentaries should feel like they need to aim for that, but but for me that's probably the kind of using it as a tool to, you know, challenge the status quo, to ask questions and all of that is definitely one of the things that kind of holds my interest in documentary, and I really think that's where, you know, queer films and, you know, queer docs, but queer films generally as well, also come in, that kind of questioning of the norms.
Yeah, and I think that leads us nicely, that sort of the activism and the political side of film programming, and how exciting that is. And again, lots of our young programmers are, you know, sensing there is real power within the job and a power to make a change. And so linking from that then to, you're working in a mainstream festival, but obviously you came from a more agitprop, you know, suggest your own festival. So can you maybe talk a bit about your approach to LGBTIQ plus programming within a position of power, and how you do that with a mainstream festival, and what are sort of some of the pros and cons of that compared with working in a smaller festival like Flare, not Flare, sorry, you know, but like a small, you know, a smaller beginning queer festival?
Yeah, so I guess, I guess DocFest is mainstream insofar as it is not a queer film festival as such, or, you know, exclusively at all. So yeah, it's kind of part of, you know, queer films are like the part of the richness of our program, alongside many other things that we look for when we're looking for a diverse program, you know, including making sure that, you know, we also have the view of filmmakers from the global south and so on. So it's also obviously not something that we you know, we don't program queer films within like a specific strand, and we don't highlight them necessarily as queer films. Like, we might to a queer audience, but not, you know, we don't slap a badge on them, kind of thing. It's just, yeah, it's kind of part of like the rich mix of that makes up our program, rather than it being sidelined or stranded or anything else. But yeah, I don't know if that.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think that's in a way, because what you know, lots of the venues and young film programmers who want to make a difference, but their slot is quite small. So there, you know, there is that sort of sometimes a discussion about, is it a strand or is it for LGBTQIQ month or Pride, you know, and then that obviously there have been discussions about female gaze seasons, doing that within International Women's Month. And so that sense that it's, you know, when you're running the show, it can just feed into everything you do. But when you're a small part of a bigger show and you are pitching, I suppose it's how young programmers might approach that and avoid sort of maybe the label on it, I guess. That sense of it, you know, maybe being tokenistic, how they can influence and make a difference with their programming, even though they aren't the director of the festival.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think there's anything, you know, wrong with showing, you know, I'm all for showing, you know, queer content for LGBTQ month, or for Pride month, in the same way that, you know, you might show a film by a Black filmmaker for Black History Month, for example. But I think the key is for that to not be the only month where you show, you know, where that's kind of allowed, whereby it's not, whereby it's not part of your program at any other point of the year. You know, that idea of, oh, but we've done that, we have a slot for that, so we can tick that box, and then we can just, you know, if you think of you know, queer films as part of, you know, the, you know, as part of the kind of amazing plethora of films that we have to play with, then why would you box it off as something that you can show then but not then? I guess that I think
that's really great, thank you. So leading on from that, can you tell us a little bit about queer film festivals that there are in the UK and internationally, and how young programmers might be able to, you know, find out about them and follow leads and do research that way?
Yeah, so absolutely. So I mean we look, in terms of how we find content for DocFest, you know, we put out an open call for submissions far and wide, and we get work that way. And of course we also looked at other festivals around the world for their program for ideas, and they range from, you know, the big kind of well-known festivals to much more kind of niche ones around the world, where we can find content that might not otherwise kind of come through our call for submissions, and that includes, you know, making sure that we're kind of looking at, you know, certain parts of the world that are underrepresented in our program or in UK programming generally, and so on. And definitely queer film festivals kind of part of that mix. So, you know, the kind of bigger ones, you know, being like Frameline and Outfest, you know, which are US festivals, but, you know, there are, you know, there are kind of, there's a Wikipedia page, you know, for all of the LGBTQ festivals around the world, of which there, you know, there are many. And yeah, I mean, just like even just this year, programmed a film in Rhyme and Rhythm called Gracefully, which is about a cross-dressing Iranian dancer where in Iran it's forbidden to dance, and it's an incredible, beautiful film, and it came from a premiered in a queer film festival in Utah called Damn These Heels, which I had never heard of.
It's a great title.
Following their programming for sure. And then just closer to home in terms of festivals where, you know, we might not look to for program per se, because we, you know, tend to launch films as premieres, but where I definitely look to for kind of inspiration in like other ways in terms of how they're kind of positioning themselves and how they're talking about the films, and kind of really leading the way on issues around access and inclusion, are Squiff in Scotland, Fringe Festival in London. These have both just happened, so we've got to wait nearly a year for them to come around again, but they both went online around October kind of time, I think. And there's a fairly new one called CineQ in Birmingham, which focuses on queer people of colour filmmakers, which, yeah, I mean, these are just you know, these are like quite small festivals in, you know, in some cases part kind of volunteer run, but just doing really exciting things, and yeah, and particularly around access and inclusion, and the kind of care that they give their audiences. Yeah, those are festivals that I would definitely recommend looking at.
Yeah, fantastic. And obviously after this week, you know, we'll probably do some resources, and we can do like a web link list for people and recommendations, etc. Because I think that's, you know, we're hoping all of these industry sessions will be followed up by a watch party. So we've got your recommendations for what to deepen. Before we go to the other questions, how did I say that? The bulk of the young programmers questions. The last question: is there a LGBTIQ plus season or program that you are particularly proud of programming that you could share, and just say a little bit about why it was successful or not? You may still be proud of it, even though it didn't necessarily be hugely, you know, a money maker or anything like that. There may have been other successes. So yeah, maybe you could just give us a flavour of something that you've done that you're really proud of in this realm.
Yeah, so I mean, we've had quite a few like LGBTQ films in the programme this year that I would be really proud of. So like Gracefully that I mentioned, and there's a couple on Sheffield Doc Fest Selects, which is available until midnight tonight. There's a film called Mon Amour, which is about the filmmaker searching for stories of love after he's lost his lover, and yeah, no, sorry, that one's not available. Anyway, but the program that I would say I'm most proud of was probably one that I put together in just in February. It was one of the last things. It was the last time I introduced a film before lockdown, which was a screening, like a retrospective of the work of Barbara Hammer, who was like pioneering feminist lesbian filmmaker of like 1970s to now, or to very recently. She passed away a couple of years ago. And yeah, I mean, I think she just speaks to a lot of the things that I'm interested in. She's super avant-garde. So her work is kind of the more kind of experimental nature that I would have programmed in Berwick. It's it's kind of early lesbian cinema, really interested in the female body, and kind of like female pleasure, and there's a kind of that kind of queer thing of like, all bodies are beautiful. They don't have to fit a particular kind of mold, or and she's just done a lot for kind of visibility of lesbian cinema, which visibility is kind of among like kind of the biggest issues for queer women and lesbian women particularly, and that absolutely extends to queer cinema, because even within queer cinema, I mean, there's a sort of canon, if you like, for queer cinema, and it is mostly cis white men filmmakers. She's incredible. I can't point to her work online because I don't think any of it is available online, although you can see trailers for films with such excellent titles as like Constitutes, and there's a real kind of humour to some of her work as well, but some of it's just beautiful. And she shot a lot of her work on Super 8, which I really like. There's a kind of real like texture to her work. So that was a program that I put together for LGBTQ month in February.
Fantastic. And that's when we met, and I learned about her through you. But also in preparation for this, I realised that Maya Deren was a lesbian, Chantal Ackerman was a lesbian, and in my film course, no mention of that. Obviously, it was avant-garde, and it was in relation to a female gaze, but it didn't talk about it. There's with the terms of the straight gaze in that mix. So I think as we move the session towards the young programmers' questions, as we start to explore the queer gaze and actually what is that for people, and starting the questioning side of this that really chimes with activism on all counts. So I'm going to move, because we've got quite a few questions, and I'm aware that I mustn't hog you, Melanie. So on that question, we've got a question from Jamie. How do you select queer films? What kind of criteria or factors influence your decision? And what would be more important to you, the subject matter and representation, or film editing and cinematography? And how do you make sure your selection is truly diverse of the whole queer community when films representing intersex people, trans men, or queer people of colour are very few and far between? So that's the question from Jamie.
So, I mean, my approach to programming queer cinema is just no different to my approach to programming any cinema. So, and I guess as we're not a queer festival, I don't feel this kind of incredible responsibility for having to, I don't have a kind of list of boxes I need to tick in terms of making sure that we represent, the kind of diversity of the population, like as a whole. So, I mean, instead, I'm looking primarily for stories and people that engage me, and it's definitely the kind of content over, for me, like how it's made in terms of cinematography and editing, to answer that question. That's more important, but I'm also interested in how we're also interested in documentaries that kind of play with the form of documentary, but that doesn't necessarily mean the production values of the cinematography and editing. It could just mean a kind of playfulness with the form, which I think is something, that that kind of playfulness, I think, is something that queer cinema is particularly good at. But yeah, I mean, I think all the time we're looking at authenticity of voice and kind of lived experience, and that's that's something that's of great importance in queer cinema. But I mean, it's that's also about it's about limiting the amount of films that we show where a filmmaker is going into another community to tell somebody else's story, whether that's geographic or to do with sexual identity or anything really. And that's not to say that we don't think that people without lived experience, it's not to say that I think that filmmakers who don't have the lived experience of the community that they're representing can't make that film, because I don't think that. It's more about kind of finding the balance, and I feel like the issue that I feel more like the issue is that it's that too many of the films that we see about the queer experience are not made or produced by queer filmmakers, and it's about kind of readdressing that. So it's not to say that they can't be part of the mix, but they hold way too much weight and responsibility for how we're represented, when there's just quite simply not more stories out there that are able to get made and get seen in order for each of those representations to hold less weight.
Yeah. I mean, I think we were talking about a little bit earlier, that sense, say, to compare with the discourse around the female gaze, and there's the Bechdel test, which is very controversial because, does it, just because there's a female character at the center of the story, doesn't necessarily have a female gaze. And I guess what you're talking about, the cinematography and the editing and that whole sense of queer directors, there would be an assumption maybe that they would have the queer gaze, but equally, putting on a label or just it's not necessarily a guarantee, or is it?
Yeah, like for me, whilst I completely get the Bechdel test thing and the F-rated and any of the comparison, for me there's something about that that's quite kind of goes against the queer embrace of like fluidity, and I kind of feel so much about the queer thing is about not putting people in boxes and things in boxes, and what constitutes a queer film to some people might, I was saying to you earlier, I programmed a short this year and I would say it's a queer short. I read it as a queer short, but I don't know if it was intended as such. I don't know if the filmmaker is, I don't know if the person sitting next to me in the cinema would consider it as such. But to me it was. So, does that make it a queer film or not? Do we put it in that box and slap that label on it or not? I don't know. And also, I feel really strongly that like queer films don't have to be about a queer subject, and they don't have to be about, not all queer films have to be about coming out or transitioning or, Strong Island on Netflix is a very good example of, a film that, you could absolutely consider a queer film, but it's the story is, an investigation into the murder of someone's brother. Like it's not classically queer story, and so then where would you put that?
Yeah.
So
I mean, I think that's it. It doesn't always have to be problematized as the subject, you know, and that's, I think, really significant for programming choices. And maybe there's a danger sometimes in LGBT festival, you know, not festivals, but like a strand, that if it's only, you know, you've only got one film to show, that can sometimes bias it in favour of, you know, problematizing LGBTIQ plus.
Yeah, and I guess in response to that question about you know, about what we look for, I guess, you know, there's also things that like we don't, you know, that we look to avoid. I mean, there's kind of, you know, there's stereotypes around how, you know, trans films are always about transitioning as though it's an overnight thing, you know, lesbians die at the end, you know, there are kind of certain tropes and stereotypes of a queer film, and particularly perhaps queer films not by queer makers, that you know, it's not to say that anyone, it's like what I was saying about representation, it's not to say that any one of those films is wrong or you should program any one of those films. It's just that when that's what we see over and over and over again, it's about addressing like the balance.
Yeah, great, thank you. I think you've probably answered this, but Beth has a question, and I think it relates to what you're saying about your view. You know, it's how there's the embrace of diversity at the heart of what your approach to the queer gaze is, or programming in general. And she asks, do you think that call-outs or spaces for women and non-binary people are excluding other people who have suffered due to the patriarchy? For example, trans men.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess it's how you kind of word the who you're inviting into that space. But yeah, I mean, I absolutely see trans men as part of that kind of queer community. They, you know, not part of cis male patriarchy, but I don't know. It's a really good question about, like, because we talk about women's spaces, and including, of course, like women and non-binary, inclusive women and non-binary people, and of course, meaning women as in all women, and including trans women. And how do we extend that to make trans men feel included and welcome where they want to be part of those spaces? That's a really good question.
That's great. Thank you.
I have the answer.
No, absolutely. Thank you. We've got another question here, which I think goes back as well to what we're talking about in terms of how young programmers can maximise their programming power within their context. And there's a question from Evangeline. A question for Melanie: how much does marketing, or how marketable a film is, come into your programming choices? Or do you simply choose content you are passionate about now? And in your early career, did you feel obliged to program films that would draw in the crowds?
I'm sure I've made compromised film programming choices, either, you know, compromised for various reasons to do pressures around. I'm sure I have in the past. I can't think of any. I mean, I feel like at DocFest we're quite lucky, because I think we maintain quite a hard editorial line where we don't allow pressure from, you know, funders sponsors, we get public subsidy to support us, not necessarily taking the biggest films that, you know, biggest as in like draw mass audiences. I mean, I guess the way that we program is we'd have different strands that are more or less accessible than or kind of mainstream than each other. So, you know, rhyme and rhythm, it tends to be quite has quite a big appeal in terms of music docs and dance docs and stuff. And then we have other strands like Ghosts and Apparitions that are much more niche, that are kind of more artist-led films, which we know might have a smaller audience, but which are really important to us to show, and we're kind of looking for a depth of engagement rather than necessarily mass engagement. But no, I mean, it's not our jobs to just program films that we think people will pay to come out and watch. Not in the subsidized sector. So no, it'd be the first. It's the films that we are passionate about.
Yeah. Fantastic. There's a sort of follow-up to that about digital and online curation.
Yeah.
From Helena, or Helene, sorry if I mispronounce, about since COVID has made online curation a necessary task and all festivals now have to program online, do you think now there'll be extra weight on digital curation, and in terms of reaching a wider audience, also making just for the films and the artist? I'm not quite sure that bit. What is your approach to this? So in terms of reaching a wider audience, but also making the curation just for the films and the artist, I think is what she means.
Yeah, so I mean, we're learning as we go on this one, on online curation, as with many of us, I think. I mean, the thing that I feel like it really just lacks is there's something about being in the cinema that means that you're so much more absorbed by the film with so many fewer distractions around you. So I guess it's trying to bear that in mind, but at the same time, we also don't want to, I don't know. So also can't let that like limit what we program for online. And I don't know. I think, I mean, we learned a lot this year from putting our program online, and we reached 30% of our audiences were completely new to DocFest, which is not something that we expected, nor particularly worked for, to be honest. So that was kind of great. That was a bonus. I guess we knew that those audiences were quite different, and I think probably one of the biggest differences is how you convert audiences from one film to another. How do you navigate, how do you kind of help lay the kind of route for their journey into the program? So, you know, often like you'll have certain hooks within a program that you think might draw a slightly broader audience, and then you make the connection from that film to another film that might be kind of smaller, have less kind of marketing and press power behind it, but you manage to kind of able to get them from point A to B. And I think that's more difficult online, and that's definitely one of the challenges that we need to find that kind of through path for next year. Yes.
That's great. And it's not, again, as a follow-up, but a similar question from Phoebe, who says she's from Sheffield. Yay. And she'd like to go into programming, and she's curious to know what are the similarities and differences between programming for a festival versus an indie cinema.
So the difference is that you have so many more films at your fingertips if you're programming for festivals and you're looking at them earlier. So we're tracking films as they're being made. we're watching films while they're still in rough cut. We're getting films submitted to us before they have shown anywhere, and we are watching and selecting films from festivals where they're making their kind of world or international premiere. And this is often before they've got a UK distributor on board. Sometimes they have, but often they don't. And so therefore you just got so many more films to choose from, which of course is incredible, and also, you know, a big challenge. You have to have a really good idea of what you're looking for, and be quite systematic in terms of where you're looking as well. Whereas if you're programming for an indie cinema, you have this, there are a slate of films that are being released that week. A finite number of films that are being released in your home country that week from which you can choose. And though of course indie cinemas do a lot of like curated seasons and specials and one-offs and things. And work with festivals, like we work with Showroom, for example. But yeah, that's the big difference. And the films that you're showing as an indie cinema might often have already been to a festival like ours in the UK, or other festivals across the UK.
Thank you. And we've got another question from Yi from Queer East. We're a first-year film festival focusing on LGBTQ plus cinema about East and Southeast Asia.
Cool.
This is very specific. Have you a suggestion for us? I mean, I think I thought of this in terms of partnerships generally and how you can draw in your audience that way. And they're asking for any suggestions for approaching and looking for cinema venue partnerships for that subject, which is East and Southeast Asia LGBTQ plus cinema.
But partnerships with cinemas in the UK or in East Asia? I wouldn't have a clue about cinemas in East Asia, I'm really sorry, but I think
it's about rather than in. I'm thinking, cool. I think about East. It's Queer East, so I don't know where you're based, Yi. You might want to put that up there, but I think it's probably UK.
See, so yes, so East Asian queer films, but in the UK. So I think, rolling out your film festival to particularly indie cinemas, I would say, more for it in the UK, sounds like a really good idea. I think there's probably the best database. I mean, the Independent Cinema Office has a database of all the UK indie cinemas, doesn't it? Or approach as a kind of route to those indie cinemas, what you could do is approach each of the different film hubs. So Julie's part of Film Hub South East, but Julie, you'll have like kind of all of the different film hubs, and that way you just contact 8 people as a way of getting to all of the cinemas, and they might be able to guide you on which cinemas within their film hub would be particularly open to that.
You could put that, UK-based Film Fest, you could put that as an email to us at Film Hub Southeast there, and we'll get we can either forward it through or get those contacts to you. I see that we're running out of time. I want to take us back to that question. We were talking about sometimes problematizing the LGBTIQ plus films, and we've got probably the last question from Isaac, who says part of Hallam's DocFest team, and thanks for giving the lowdown. It says the question's a bit heavy, has been reading B. Ruby Rich's book on new queer cinema.
Yeah.
And she talks about disconnect with queer audiences in terms of films shown by indie cinemas. A lot of the films focusing on aspects of the queer community and gay lived experiences that were more negative. So we talked a bit about that. And so they say, have you encountered any experiences like this programming queer cinema? And I guess for this bit, do you have any advice or when it comes to balancing positive representation while tackling difficult issues, and or maybe some recommendations of some great films that might balance out a programme?
Yeah, thanks. That's a very good question. So yes, I think there's definitely an issue with, there's an issue with queer cinema dealing with the issues, problematizing of the queer experience. I mean, I guess one thing I'd say is I'm really interested in queer cinema that's not necessarily, as I said before, like even explicitly about the so-called queer experience. I mean, I'm interested, so I mentioned like Strong Island as an example of a film that is definitely for me a queer film, but is not about the queer experience. I mean, let alone it being problematized as such. One of the films that I recommended everyone watch is called, it's on BFI Play for anyone who's got access to that. It's called Out, or it was called Out. We world premiered at DocFest last year and it was called Out. Now it might be called something else, like Out, I can't remember, or Coming Out. And it's a film that compiles clips and postings of people's experience of coming out on YouTube. So it's where people have filmed themselves coming out to friends, family, as queer, gay, trans, and posted it to YouTube, which is a very kind of like, I mean, they're all quite a bit younger than me. Like the idea of doing that for me is quite, but we're talking about a generation of people who like live their life on YouTube, and this is part of it. And one of the really great things about that film, I think, is that it shows not just a full range of different people coming out in different ways, but a whole range of reactions and responses that they get from that. And of course, some of them are really really upsetting responses from close family and friends who are responding in a way that's really upsetting to see. But some of them are some of the responses to these coming out scenes are really like beautiful and compassionate, and so I mean that's just one, it's just an example of one film that I liked because it shows kind of positive and negative responses around something that's very much specific to the kind of queer experience. But sorry.
No, that's brilliant. I'm so sorry, but we've come out of time and I'm going to get in trouble if we go over. So I'm sorry to Christina and Alicia, I haven't been able to answer your questions, but do come back for our next webinar because they were more general about film programming and the job itself. So please come back next month. Our next webinar is on the 17th of December. And it's on disability on film, access and inclusion. So put that in your diaries. But to finish tonight with the watch party recommendations that we've got from Melanie, do go on, choose with your young programmer group which ones you might go for, and then have a Zoom discussion after. We'd love to get any feedback. We'll obviously be putting together some resources to follow up from this session. And just to say a massive thank you, Melanie. And if there is anything you want to say that you didn't have time, I'll get in trouble for you to just squeeze it in. But it's been really fascinating and inspiring to talk to you. Thank you for taking the time. And I'll follow up with you on what responses we get this year from young programmer groups programming LGBTIQ+ programs, and the responses, not always just bums on seats, but maybe just changing hearts and minds and making a difference. So if there is anything else you would like to say, squeeze it in. I think we could just about, but if not, thank you so much for coming.
I guess just to end with a few more recommendations, I just couldn't recommend more the work of Desiree Akhavan. I think The Bisexual, which is actually a TV programme, not a film, is on Channel 4. Cheryl Dunier's work, I think you'd be able to find online. She's really interesting in creating work that kind of melds fiction and non-fiction. The Wachowski sisters, Chantal Ackerman you mentioned, I think No Home Movie is on BFI Player. Celine Sciamma, if you watch Portrait of a Lady on Fire, which is beautiful, also watch Tomboy, which is also I think on BFI Player. Yeah, I could go on, but I will stop now.
Thank you. Wonderful. We've got a lot of watching to be doing before the next one. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much, everyone, for your questions. I could just see them now. All of I've just opened the chat. Thank you. That's brilliant.
Brilliant.
Really
Thank you so much. Have a great evening and see you next month at all the young programmers, and enjoy your watching over the next few days. Thank you. Bye.